Very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me here, and thanks to Guillermo for doing that. Um, Maybe I will just start out by quickly making a connection with Australasia because my talk very much centers on Arthur Prior, who is, I don't know, perhaps New Zealand's best known philosophical logician. Actually, in one way, it's kind of weird for me to be talking about this with these slides because I'm myself originally from New Zealand, as maybe some of you heard in the little interaction with Sasha before this. I'm from Hamilton in New Zealand, and so I'm a Kiwi who's been working in Europe for about 40 years now. So very often when I'm talking about Arthur Prior in Europe, I sort of tell people that he's from this very strange and faraway country called New Zealand, and I sometimes even put a map up there showing where New Zealand is and showing where Masterton is, where Prior was brought up, and going into Prior's history and so on. So uh, here, I guess when I say he's perhaps New Zealand's best known philosophical logician, I guess many of the people in the audience will just sort of nod and say, yeah, that's quite possibly true. And maybe some of you will be thinking Richard Sylvan's in there with a good claim and so on, but whatever. And also thinking, yes, but there's also some really good logicians as opposed to philosophical logicians. But anyway, basically, I would say Prior's best known claim to fame, even though he did a lot of interesting work in a lot of areas, centered on his invention of tense logic. Because this is a form of modal logic. He was the one who saw that the logic of time could perhaps be expressed or captured in a certain way by using the idea of using modal logic for this. And he was very creative. Um, when you start thinking about the logic of time, there are many interesting problems, many interesting ideas, many puzzles, philosophical and technical. And he often opened the doors to many of these things. Uh, Perhaps maybe the best known one, and certainly if you're a computer scientist, one that paid off a lot was how best to handle branching time logic. So some of the fundamental distinctions and ideas were introduced by him with the help of some input from a famous letter by the 15-year-old Saul Kripke at the time. Um, so we'll be hearing a lot about tense logic and what happens. He's also come to be called maybe also, but he's also is also been realized. By the way, can everybody see the entire screen here? Because I'm slightly blocked. I can't see and am I moving the screen now? Do you see my
Yeah,
screen moving? Okay, yeah.
yes,
Okay,
yes, and
that's
yes.
that's not so good. Okay, so I'll just leave it like that. Um, he also came to be known as the clearly now recognized as the inventor of hybrid logic. Um, Roughly speaking, versions of modal logic in which you've got special propositions that are true at one unique naming time. And my talk is basically going to revolve around this. In fact, what I just want to do in the next few slides is just to make sure we're on the same page about the basics of tense and modal logic, because what I want to head for is just why I call this talk quasi propositions and quasi individuals. So just, I suspect that I'm talking to people who know all this, that by a language of tense logic, I just mean that we've got a collection of atoms, typically written P, Q, and so on. And these symbols stand for time varying propositions. So propositions that can have different truth values at different times. I've got the word medieval propositions there because when Prior was writing, propositions were more thought of as what we would now call eternal propositions, and time varying was seen as an extra factor that you brought into them. Prior returned to medieval philosophy and insisted on that time varying propositions were legitimate things to study. Maybe to some extent now, with the more technical audience, these This distinction maybe is less important and is seen just as a working decision about how you model sort of these sort of things. But at the time, it was a living debate, I guess, and so on. Um, we build more complex propositions using Boolean operators. So just to use familiar terminology, we've got two box diamond pairs, G and F, where G is the universal quantifier over future time, so it is always going to be the case. And F, we think of existential at some future time. And we've got a pass scanning pair, H and P, where H is usually glossed as it always has been the case from the point where we're evaluating now, and PP basically meaning at some past time. So basically a dual now. Now, this is a very much an ordinary modal logic, though the details were not so clear at Prior's time. In fact, the real details about how all this hung together probably didn't come clear until the 60s. But both these operators satisfy what's known as the K axioms. So basically, the axioms that allow you to push the boxes here, the G and the H, in over the implication symbol, and Prior's axioms, nice little axioms that if something phi is true now, it is always going to be the case that it was the case at phi. So you could always look, you can, no matter where you look forward, you can always look back and find that phi point. And similarly, if you, no matter how you look into the past, phi, it always has been the case that it will be the case that phi. And in addition to that, you've got other axioms. You've got, for example, FF phi implies F phi. Um, that guarantees that the your conception of time is transitive, and as one would hope, PP phi implies P phi. That's also provable. If you can see it's a time by taking two steps to the past, you can see it in one. No surprises there. Now, let's just move this to hybrid logic, but let's stay in the setting of temporal logic. Um, Prior, for reasons that I'll explain later, wanted this language of time. Perhaps I should emphasize that this tense logic for Prior was, how can I put it, not merely an interesting language. It was, in some sense, metaphysically fundamental. In some sense, he believed that very simple modal language, bimodal language, captured the essence of reasoning in time because, so to speak, one was in time, one is embedded in time and taking a local perspective. But in his later work, let's say starting in about the mid 60s, and I'm putting this in modern terminology, he had the idea of adding a second sort of atomic formula. Actually, he had many, many different ideas about how to do this, and I'm putting it very much in contemporary terminology. The way it's been distilled now is that we add a second form of atomic formula called a nominal. These symbols are typically nowadays written by I, J, K, and L. And if we're putting it in modern notation, both the traditional type of atom, P, Q, R, and so on, and the I's and the K's can be combined to form more complex formulas in the usual way. So I'm displaying a formula there, F, I, and P, and F, I, and Q implies F, P, and Q. This is a well-formed formula, and the only thing, so to speak, that is non-standard over ordinary tense logic is that, so to speak, you've got two blue-colored atomic symbols, both the currences of I and the rest are black-colored. But apart from that, it's perfectly normal. Now, in modern hybrid logic, oh no, let me just say this. What also should be remarked upon here is that we already have a richer logic. Um, the first formula that is displayed there is F, R, and P, so two ordinary propositional variables, and F, R, and Q, so again two ordinary variables, implies F, P, and Q. This obviously is falsifiable on some frames. Just because I see R and P in the future and R and Q at some other future point, this does not mean that there is any point that makes both P and Q true together. On the other hand, um, if we make this a hybrid tense logical formula, we change that R to an I, and we say if I and P and if I and Q, then obviously we have F, P, and Q because I, the nominal, is true at one distinct time. It is named this time, which is why it has come to have the name a nominal. So that has become valid. So nominal's name, and this adds to the expressive power. Okay. Now, how can I put this? In modern hybrid logic, we also add a unary operator, the at operator or the satisfaction operator. It's kind of like just this obvious and tempting thing to do. You can now name times, say, or whatever you're dealing with using nominals I. Why not add a collection of operators, the at symbol subscripted with an I, and with the very, very obvious semantics that at I phi asserts that phi is satisfied at the point named by the nominal I. Okay. How can I put it? The temptation is too great. We've just got to yield to it. These look like very natural modal operators to have. There's a few remarks that should be made about this operator. First, please note that if at I phi is true at some time t, then it is true at all times. Because in some sense, what you've done by putting the at I in front of it is you have made the truth of the underlying formula true about what is happening at the unique point named I. And similarly, if at I phi is false at some time t, then it is false at all times, because in both cases, all you're doing is you are looking at one point in the model. No matter where you evaluate an at I, you jump to one point in the model. You are scanning one particular local point, and that means that either it's true everywhere or it's false everywhere. This is important for a number of reasons, because in a certain sense, you could argue that you've included a little bit of globality. uh, you can, in a certain sense, modal logic is famous because of internal perspective. You evaluate at a point, whereas this is a jump to any named point operator. You're bringing in some kind of notion of non-locality into the picture. Maybe another thing to notice is that these are self-dual operators. At I phi holds if and only if not at I not phi is valid. So they are self-dual modal operators. And please forgive me. I just want to check that I have met. Uh, yes, I shouldn't. I should have. Oh, and yes. Let me just move that screen up a little bit because I'm not seeing it fully. Uh, oh, yes. Please also note that we have the similar K axiom. At I, phi implies at I implies at I psi. Okay. Now, why did I call this talk quasi propositions and quasi individuals? Basically, because today's talk is a reflection on this short and relatively non-technical paper, which was first published in Pryor's 1968 book, Papers on Time and Tense. I think it's one of the most interesting papers that Pryor ever wrote, and I think he wrote a lot of interesting papers. Why do I say this is an interesting paper? Okay. Firstly, you could make, I think, a very substantial argument, and I will sketch that here, that essentially in this paper, Pryor invented description logic. He didn't call it description logic, he called it egocentric logic, but it is, at least in part, basically what is the first version of the forms of description logic, not the original forms of the 1970s, perhaps, but the form in which they became canonical, the modal logic formulas that emerged, the modal logics that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s. He invented the first description logic, probably a good 10 years in front of everybody else. But actually, it's a paper that raises lots of other issues, which all in one way or another are connected with this. For a start, as was mentioned earlier, I'm a co-author of a book on modal logic, but that book, how can I put this? That book is dedicated to Johann van Bentham, who was the PhD supervisor of all three of the authors. So it's very much a presentation of modal logic from the standpoint of Amsterdam style modal logic, which roughly speaking says modal logic can be thought of as a way of talking about frames, offers a lot of freedom in what constitutes a modal language, but basically says think semantically, think maybe a little bit creatively, don't restrict yourself to the normal applications of modal logic, but try to think very broadly about what modal logic is. And also, in this sense, we're getting something that Prior's seen absolutely explicitly. Prior basically starts all of a sudden in his writing using these words quasi modalities and quasi individuals. And in fact, in this paper, he starts talking about people propositions. Okay, so this is very much in the style of Amsterdam modal logic, except nowadays, pretty much we just say, well, don't bother with the quasi. Okay, we've got modalities for reasoning about ordinary style stuff, not just the kind of stuff that modal logic is usually taken for reasoning about, namely abstract things like worlds or knowledge states or times, these rather abstract entities, but that in some sense it is just another logic. Okay. Prior, who definitely, how can I put this, was in many ways a very down to earth philosopher. He did not really have very much time for anything we would now call continental philosophy or things like this, but he conceded, perhaps a little reluctantly, that um, this logic, which internalized so much stuff, was a logic in which some of the ideas that you came across in writers like Leibniz and like Leibniz, philosophical idealism made a certain sort of sense. And he also stumbled into certain technical themes. Stumbled, sorry, that's a rather, that's very, very imprecise. He realized that in some sense there was a conflict between his nice local way of thinking about um, modal logic or his love of modal logic, and also that it was very important that in some sense you had some kind of universal force in the language, some way of seeing larger portions of the model. Like I have introduced the at operator. Mm, in some versions, Prior does that explicitly, but more usually he introduces what we would now call the modal operator, a modality which simply says at all points in the model phi, or at some point in the model phi. And then you can use things to say things like, well, at all points where I is true, then phi is true. So in other words, he basically introduces the universal modality to get at the at operator. So that's an important thing. Please forgive me again for doing this. And weirdly, he has something not very rather little to say about special relativity in this short paper. In fact, what he says is that the resulting logic of people propositions is very like sorry, is very like is yes, he says rather like a tense logic of special relativity. Sorry, I'm having trouble. I'm seeing all of you along the bottom of the screen, and I'm not quite sure how to kill that, but it's blocking my view a bit. Maybe the one thing I'd like to get is that this paper is actually a surprisingly positive response to what you could view as a philosophical setback, and I want to explain this. So today's discussion, I think a lot of it is going to be a little bit of history. I want just to make Prior's philosophical problem that this very, very cheerful little paper is reacting to, and how this led Prior a little bit unwillingly to think ordinary tense logic as description logic. Um, I'll sketch a reformulation and extension of Prior's description logic and contemporary hybrid logic, and time permitting, and I think there probably will be time, some comments on Prior's remark that his description logic is rather like the tense logic of special relativity. Okay. Um, it's rather like the special of special relativity. And then basically I'll be wrapping up and mentioning about how you take this work forward. As I said, as I said, Prior um, the work I'm talking about is some of Pryor's last work. Arthur Pryor died in 1969, and the final 3 years were, I think, marked by a clear sense that he had achieved many of the goals of his tense logical project. But also, interestingly and intriguingly and sadly, that actually certain things could be reset, certain things could be rethought, and I think it's utterly clear from his last writings that he's setting off in a slightly new direction and he's doing exciting work which he was unable to finish. Now, what I've done here, which I'll fill out on the slides, is I guess you could say that his crowning book was Past, Present, and Future, and this really brings together all his writings over the past decade plus, stretching back to about 1953 or 1954. He wraps them all up in this book called Past, Present, and Future. This book lays the foundations for lots of stuff. He opens up his work on branching time. There's lots of very, very nice technical ideas in there, lots of nice lots of nice explorations of branching time logic and so on. And then he follows this up with a book the following year in 1968 called Papers on Time and Tense. Now, this is a very, very good collection of papers, and it was republished, I think, in again, let me just check it was republished again in 2003, edited by Per Hasley, Peter Erstrom, Torben Breuner, and Jack Copeland. Um, uh, they did a service to the community, I think, in converting Pride's original writing, which was in Polish notation, into Russell style notation, which made things a lot more accessible, and I think opened Prior's work up to a broader audience. But it is worth looking at the difference. It's worth looking at one particular point in the 1968 edition. Okay. One of the key papers there is a paper called Tense Logic and the Logic of Earlier and Later. This is a great paper. This is Prior's clearest, I would say, clearest and most, how can I put it, rampant presentation of hybrid logic. Okay, rampant? What's he doing? Right from the word go, in his early work and going through past, present, and future, as I said earlier, Prior views tense logic as philosophically significant. This is the way of thinking about time. This is this way of philosophizing about time. This logic, in a certain sense, embodies time because of this internal A series presentist. It makes it easy. It makes it possible to represent the fact that we are living in time. Um, he's, however, does have one slight problem. He has always also worked with a certain B series language, what we would now call a correspondence language, which is essentially a first order language of time. But right from the start, right from his very, very first paper on tense logic, he views this first order correspondence language as a cheat. It uses a free variable to represent the present. And he finds this a low illusion. This is just giving an illusion of understanding. It doesn't really get to what's going on. Nonetheless, there is a very, very blunt fact that that first order language is obviously more expressively powerful than this apparently philosophically dominant A series language. I mean, we don't have to look for examples. I think probably everybody who's done some course in modal logic knows that there's some very obvious things that you can't express with a modal language. You don't have an axiom, for example, for irreflexivity. No point of time precedes itself. So somehow this very fundamental fact of time is not reflected in Prior's language. It's not reflected in Prior's preferred language, but it is reflected in the other language. Prior wouldn't have been able to prove all this stuff, but it is now fairly obvious stuff. In this language, tense logic and the logic of earlier and later, he basically faces up to his biggest opponent or opponent in his head, Willard Van Ormond Quine. He bases it loosely, the structure, on a famous paper by Willard Van Orman Quine, and he basically takes the first order language of time, he takes it apart in four stages, and at a crucial stage, he introduces nominals, which is essentially giving him something in the object language that talks about individual time. He's always loved quantifying over propositions, so he's used doing this in a second order setting, but he's also quantifying across these nominals, and he triumphantly announces that now he can do all this, and the A series language has captured the B series language. The following paper is strange. Paper 11, tense logic and the logic of earlier and later. It's pretty much technical all the way, except for the last section. Quasi proposition and quasi individuals is different. It's short, it's ruminative. There's very little in the way of formalization. It's just discussion, and it's called quasi propositions and quasi individuals. Okay, now um, what is going on here? Okay, well, let me come back to this. Okay, the point is made clear in the introduction to the first edition. This is Prior's voice. It is no accident that quasi-propositions and quasi-individual comes right after tense logic and the logic of earlier and later. Um, so, sorry, that was my voice. I'm sorry, not Prior's. Funnily enough, I've actually just flown back from New Zealand 24 hours ago to visit my family, so I'm actually totally jet lagged and not sure which side of the world I am. So please forgive my slight yeah. Uh, there is not much symbolism in this paper, which might for that reason have better been placed earlier, but it is too close in subject matter to paper 11 to be placed anywhere but immediately after it. Um, and as I said, this is what he says about it. The logic of as I say, this is a rampant paper. Paper 11 is a rampant paper. The logic of the earlier and later relation is something to be embedded in tense logic rather than vice versa. This reversal is the main topic of paper 11 on tense logic and the earlier and later, in which I move through a succession of calculi in which tense logic is first dominated by the theory of the time and the earlier later relation, so putting that in modern terminology, by the first order formalization, and then progressively takes over. Okay. Now, this, however, is what he says about the following paper, quasi-proposition and quasi-individuals, and the one that could not be placed anywhere else except right after. Paper 11 on quasi-propositions and quasi-individual points out that a similar reversal is formally possible, whether or not it is philosophically desirable, in other areas than tense logic. That is, there are other areas in which predicates of individuals, like the earlier later relation between instants, can be replaced by propositions, like tenses. In other words, somewhere between the triumphalism, I have finally come up with a language which allows me to find the logic of time. It's basically taking my beloved tense logic. Okay, we quantify our propositions and we've got these nominals. That's where we're working. And suddenly, to some extent at least, the mental breaks go and he realizes, well, of course, if I can do this for time, I can also do the same trick for just about anything. There's a quandary here. Tense logic was meant to be special because it was the logic of time, but now we can actually use this to talk about anything, of course, in just the same way as we do in modern modal logic. The interesting thing, and that's why you just got to love Arthur Prior, is he bites on the bullet. That's essentially what he does on the paper. He bites on the bullet, and he starts exploring the ramifications of it. Um, um, so what he does, you might say that okay, so basically Prior has seen this point, And Price somewhat dry comment in the preface that a similar reversal is formally possible is vividly illustrated in quasi propositions and quasi individuals because he shows that what is formally a tense logic can be developed in a novel setting, people and their relative heights. So the simplest way of seeing what's going on here is that instead of thinking of the points in a model as times and this, we think of them as heights of people, and we're thinking about relative heights. So tense logic becomes description logic. The elements in the model are now people, and the relation between them is not the flow of time. The relation between them is relative heights. It's in one sense, this is a very minimal thing to say, a good example of Pryor, to use his own words, acting as a lawyer and doing his best for his clients. Pryor liked the metaphor of the logician as lawyer, but it seems much stronger than that. I mean, in many ways, you might say that this realization has at least upset the apple cart, or at least made Pryor see that there is perhaps more to be asked about what his philosophical goals actually are. But you cannot read this paper and not see that Pryor really likes what is going on with this language. He actually half falls in love. He is tempted by the idea of thinking, well, why not have a modal logic in which, so to speak, the elements in the model are people? Why not have, to use his own words, people propositions? Um, and this is utterly explicit in quasi propositions and quasi individuals. He talks about a language in which there are no proper names and pronouns, but in which the ultimate subject of every sentence is understood to be the speaker. By the way, if you make a mental note of that, no proper names or pronouns, that seems a slightly strange thing to me, and we'll just get rid of this when I look at the way that you would formalize this nowadays. Okay. Um, and in this paper, what he does is he wants to show that this egocentric language, I tend to refer to it as a description logic, but Pryor's word for it is this egocentric language, gives a logic that looks very much like tense logic. And I'd now just like to represent the first 3 pages of quasi propositions and quasi individuals using contemporary notations and terminology. So let's just consider, what do we have for atomic propositions? Well, we've got such things as sitting, drinking, smoking. And each of these atomic propositions means, because we're thinking about these as something that's happening at a particular individual, I am sitting, I am drinking, I am smoking. So these are Pryor's examples. And we could add items such as swearing, gambling, praying, watching TV, and so on. But once again, as Price says, these are to be interpreted egocentrically. That is, they are to be read as I am sitting, I am standing, I am watching TV, and so on. Okay. Now, Pryor writes all this in the language of tense logic because he's eager to show that his tense logic transfers to this setting. And even though I think this is also very, very clear why this transfers. I want to emphasize the links between Pryor's egocentric logic and contemporary Amsterdam style modal logic and description logic. I want to use the following symbols. I mean, I would like to call them modalities, but let's be Priorian here and call them quasi modalities. I'm going to be using such symbols as tall, short. Oh, sorry, diamond tall, box tall, diamond short, and box short. And for example, the sentence, I am happy and at a party, and everyone shorter than me is drinking, and someone taller than me is smoking, we'd represent that as happy and at party, and everyone shorter than me is drinking, and someone taller than me is smoking. Okay, so that would be the kind of thing that he was going on there. Um, by the way, it's worth noting that well, quasi-modalities can also be nested. So, for example, we can write expressions like someone taller, there is someone taller than me, and everyone shorter than that person is watching TV and laughing. So, okay. Note, incidentally, that implies that watching TV and laughing is true because that means I am watching TV and I am laughing. Okay, because someone taller than me and then everyone shorter than that, you are quantifying over yourself. So this is really just a tense logical validity, but written in this description logic style notation. Okay. Um, so let's just run through the sort of axioms that you get here. Very obviously, you have, how can I put it? This is just the tense logical stuff rewritten. Short obeys the K axiom, tall obeys the K axiom, and we've basically got the prior style axiom. If phi is true, then everyone, then no matter which shorter people I look at, uh, there is a taller person who has the phi property, namely me, and if the property phi holds of me, then everyone, then no matter which taller people I look at, there is a taller person with that property, or make exemplifying that proposition. Uh, it's very easy to go between the two ways of talking of having a property and so on. We've also got we've also got the axioms tall phi implies tall phi, and we're strong enough to prove short phi implies short phi. Okay, so it's also worth remarking that what we've written in that notation, happy and at party, and short, everyone shorter drinking and someone taller smoking, you'd write that in contemporary DL as something like happy at party for all shorter, and there exists a taller. I mean, I think the link between the two notations is transparent. This is in the what's called the T-box notation, because contemporary description logic also has, let's say, the ability to use nominals and so on. The syntax is slightly different, but they can do all the hybrid stuff that I'm talking about. But this is very much one version of description logic, and it's arriving, I would say, at least 10 years before this was the sort of thing that was taken for granted. What really gets me is that Pryor has seen the crucial point here. As he says, there is, in short, a pretty detailed formal parallel between tense logic and this rather simple type of egocentric logic. In fact, we can obtain something more or less like tense logic if we take any first order theory whatsoever, treat its one place predicates as if they were propositions, and treat an n plus one place function with n predicate arguments and one individual argument as an n place function of propositions. And again, this is Pryor's voice. That is, we can equate something of the form f da, 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 with a included as, let's say, a first order variable, with something of the form f dash n places, evaluate it with a as an argument, and drop the a. I like this very much because, this is just so, how would I put it? This is just so quite close in spirit to the way that you sort of write down the contemporary standard translation, and he's clearly seen it in full generality, and he's clearly seen it in full generality, and yeah, and as I said, he accepts the consequences. That you really can do this, and yes, he first saw it in his tense logical language, but in fact, you can do this uh, but in fact that you can take any first order, you can take, sorry, he first saw this in connection with the first order logic of time, but you could in fact take any first order language and carry out a similar sort of things. What he begins to see is, well, what exactly did we need to do to make this work? And it's here that things start to get interesting. First of all, you do need, in some sense, to have something in the object language to represent the individual. So you need something like nominals. This, however, and nowadays in hybrid logic, this is quite clear, that's not quite enough. In some sense, you also need to globalize the underlying modal language a bit. In the modern semantics, uh, in Kripke's semantics, everything is local. You express the relations that you're looking at, and you explore them internally using box and diamond modalities. Um, if you really want to be able to sort of carry out this reduction, you do need to have the universal modality. You do need something that enables you to say something happens at a particular point so that you can quantify across all points in your model in order for your universal modality to bite on everything. This is quite easy to prove, but Prior is suddenly seeing this, and a lot of the discussion in this paper is devoted to exploring some first ideas about what's going on here. Okay, so let me just drop the discussion at that point. I'll come here and just say, how would we probably do this nowadays? Okay, so the language that Prior is using, the first description logic, enriched in one way. Basically, you've got propositional variables and P, you've got nominals A, you've got negate, you've got the Booleans. We're going to allow ourselves to say things like at a particular individual A, phi holes, at all tall individuals, at all shorter individuals. So we've got this at a phi. This is giving us this little finger of globality here that Prior wants. We define the diamonds in the obvious way. Someone is taller means not everybody, not everybody. Sorry, tall phi means it's not true. It's not true that everybody taller than me, not phi is true, and so on. And we'll say the formula is pure if the only atoms it contains are the nominals. Okay. Um, Nominals have become propositions that name people. Um, the satisfaction operators, and this is essentially why Prior is using, though in a different notation, allow you to face things like this. At A, the tall relation holds with B. That's basically a way that saying A is taller than B. So you've got that relational thing in the object language. So you might say that Beth is taller than Anne, and this, for example, says that Dana is shorter than everyone taller than Chloe. So at Chloe, tall, everyone taller than Chloe is shorter than Dana. Um, so we have enriched this in one thing. Prior said he wasn't going to have any ordinary proper names or any pronouns, but I've just sort of said let the nominals go everywhere. Prior's really got them. Why make the we are able to move between the perspective of different named individuals. So this is Prior's first description logic with actually just a little bit more expressive strength. Okay. And how can I put it? For the formalities, a frame is just a pair WST, where W is a non-empty set, and we are to think of its elements as people, and ST is the shorter, taller relation, and a model is simply some such frame, equipped also with a nomination, a valuation for all the ordinary propositional variables, so where every propositional variable is true, but also a nomination which tells you which nominal names which individual. And we then have the truth definition. A proposition is true at a certain person, W, if the valuation makes it true. And A is true at a certain person, W, if in fact uh, that is the proposition that the nomination A names. The Boolean cases work as expected, and to evaluate at a certain person, W at I phi, that actually means you've got to change your perspective and look at that named individual and establish taller phi means that all taller people, shorter phi means that all shorter people. The axioms, or at least that is the axiom where we make no assumptions about ST except that it is a binary relation, is standard. Simply take any axiomatization of basic tense logic. This is essentially the tense logical axioms known to Prior, and we add certain axioms for at. Prior wouldn't have found any of these axioms surprising. He tended not to use the at operator as a primitive in the modal setting. He tended to use the global modality, but he certainly recognized all these things. You got things like that, well, the at I obeys things like the K axiom. You've got things like if you know that A and P, then you've got at AP. You've got this thing, you've got the self-duality of the at operators, and you've basically got the thing that it's only the last of an inmost string of at operators that counts. So at B, at AP, that holds if and only if at AP. It's only the last jump to a particular individual that works. You've got a complete theory of equality in there. So you've got at A, at B, if and only if at BA. And you've got this last one, which basically gives you both the sort of so so at if at AB and at BP, then at AP. This is also gives you transitivity for nominals if you substitute say a nominal C for P, but also it's just telling you that we've got full agreement. So it's in a sense a kind of just the ordinary just the ordinary law for equality, and you've got interaction axioms that if by looking forward or back you see that at P is true, then you already know that at P is true. So in other words, you're seeing that the at I operator here in conjunction with the nominals is giving you a theory of equality. And you can see that ATI is pretty much working like an S5 modality. It's the richest global seeing thing. You'll recall that the S5 logic is perhaps the simplest modal logic in a certain sense. You don't get any true nested modalities, and that's what's happening here. Now, what about a completeness result for this, where ST is genuinely height relation? And I must admit, here, in a certain sense, we played a little game because Prior was writing this at a time when yes, so cryptic semantics had been around, but Prior mm, Prior was writing almost using this pre-Kripkean notation. It was a very, very intuitive paper, and what we were trying to do is we were trying to formalize exactly Prior's line of reasoning because he makes all these little remarks all the way through, like this particular thing only holds if there are at least two heights. And then later on, he makes a similar thing about the link with special relativity. So actually, what I'm going to sort of first tell you about is quasi-height frames, which basically is our formalization of what Prior is doing in this paper. Then I'll tell you about induced height frames. So if you find the presentation of quasi-height frames a little strange, I think everything will just become completely obvious when I tell you about induced height frames. Okay, so what do we need to talk about this? And here's just an example of the sort of model that Prior's thinking about. Here we've got 11 people: Anne, Beth, Chloe, and Dana. They're of the same height. Evan, Fred, and Greg. Okay, they're a lower height, so I just want you to read up the thing. And then the shortest people are Hans, Evan, Jane, and Kate. 11 people, three heights. And basically, the first axiom that you need is if two people are in the same row, then they are taller than the same people. Okay. And actually, I wish I had used slightly different things, but the point is that if two people are the same row, they are taller than the same people. So, for example, Fred and Evan are taller than the same people. I think that's fairly obvious. And then you've got the reverse thing that uh, so sorry, I'm so sorry. That's then taller than the same property. And here we're looking at the same model. And here now we're looking at if two people are in the same row, then they are shorter than the same people. And again, I think that's obvious, like Evan and Fred, they are shorter than Annabeth, Chloe, and Dana. That's the way it works. Now, here's kind of where it gets interesting. Prior really wanted the universal modality. Um, he wanted basically to be able to zigzag between arbitrary people using the ST relation. And he makes this little remark, which he doesn't elaborate on, that this is possible only when there are at least two distinct heights. Now, there's a natural axiom for this property, which we call the ZZ axiom. And it's basically the sort of thing that says when you look at a model like that, okay, then if you've got a model like that, then basically you can move from any person like Fred. I can move to Evan by going up to Beth and down to Evan, or up to Chloe and down to Evan. So, in other words, from any point in there, every other point is accessible in at most two up or down moves. Maybe you just need to move up. Maybe you not just need to move down. Maybe you need to move up and down. Pretty obvious. Note in particular that Fred can move to Fred because, for example, Fred can move up to Chloe and then down to Fred. And this is the essence of Pryor's remark that you need at least two people in the model, because if you've got a singleton model here, if you've got if you've got a model in which you've just got one row like Evan, Fred, or Greg, you've got a model that's been cut apart. Nobody can see themselves. Reversal modality, because you cannot move horizontally. Always got to move via the zigzag relation. Now, basically, that is what we abstract from Pryor's work. And once we've done this, it's pretty easy to say what this logic is, because using hybrid logic, you can just write down, we want our models to be irreflexive. Nobody is taller than themselves. We want height to be transitive. In the models, as I've just explained, we want them to make the taller than the same property true, and we want them to make the shorter than the same true. And optionally, well, Pryor would always want to make the ZZ axiom true. And how can I put it? It is easy using a Lindenbaum technique to prove that you can make a model that works like this and has all of these desired properties, and that's nice. It's more or less automatic. But is correct, is this actually the natural notion of height? I think this next remark is pretty easy, but let's just run through it. Sorry, height is something that is typically done via measurement. Here's an alternative notion in terms of measurement, that if you've got a frame, we say that F is an induced height frame as if there is a strict total order and a strong homomorphism from WST to H less than. And by a strong homomorphism, I simply mean that it is something that, you know, preserves both ways, the relation. So we can imagine H less than as being the height measuring stick, and the strong homomorphism, H as being the measurement, and the shorter taller relation is what is ever induced by this measurement. Um, Basically, well, it takes a little bit of work, but I think the basic point is clean. These two notions of height are the same. If we just go back to our example, what we're basically saying here is that, look, when you think about it, we can lump Anne, Beth, Chloe, and Dana together. That's the third. That's height three. Evan, Fred, and Greg together. That's height two. And Hans, Evan, Jane, and Kate together. That's height one. We've got a little measuring stick, one, two, three on the right-hand side. So this is also an induced height frame because we can make that out. And what we get is that if we that the basic logic is respect to all the quasi height frames. If you add the if you add um, if you add the ZZ thing, the thing there is at least there is a sorry, um, and basically, how can I put sorry? I'm sorry that the ZZ thing, which demands at least one height, that is, if you add that axiom, then you're complete with respect to the induced height frames where the homomorphism is not a constant function. There are more than two heights. I think it's pretty obvious, and that's what you get. And this is really what Pryor is doing this. Okay. Now, here's where he makes his other little remark, and let me just do this. At this point, Pryor makes this very unexpected remark. Now, at this point, egocentric logic, note the self quotes, is rather like the tense logic that might be extracted from the earlier, later relation of the special relativity. Okay. The point instants that are not here now, but are not absolutely past or future either, are like the persons who are neither taller nor shorter than, nor yet identical with the speaker. Okay. So that's an intriguing remark. And we looked at this a bit. What does this actually mean? So look at the space-time diagram. Essentially, you've got let's say the now point at the middle. We've got that, and we've got the future points in the light cone above, and the past point in the light cone below. It's quite easy to check that such frames validate the basic axioms plus irreflexivity and transitivity. So I guess so far so good. Moreover, if we assume, and Pryor does this in other word, that the light cones of a space-time diagram extend endlessly into the past and future, then we certainly have the ZZ property too. We can always zigzag our way, given this sort of, indefinite extensibility of time into the past and the future. Pryor makes that assumption, and in other classic works, other people make that assumption. So far, so good. You can say, okay, that's good. What is interesting, though, is that I would say that the really other parts are clearly falsified. Okay, so neither taller than the same nor shorter than the same work. Basically, to see this, consider points A and B. Let's suppose they are space-like separated. You take any point C on the light segment between A and B, and the point of intersection of the light cones. You can show that A is in the future of C, but B is not, and TTS is falsified, and the same with the other thing. Now, again, I mean, I don't want to, I mean, again, this is really just a soundness thing, but I think this is kind of a big difference. I mean, the basic thing is that the TTS and the ST axioms force height frames to be essentially one-dimensional. That's what I showed you in the axiom. If you've got a little nice things of height frames, you can basically collapse them down to a single measuring rod. But you can't, obviously, squash together space-like separated points. That's not the way the logic of relativity works. These sort of space-time diagrams shown here are genuinely two-dimensional, whereas the height frames weren't. Um, Now, here I could make a lot of remarks. The first thing is that this work led Pryor in a number of new directions, and I think that this work reported here is perhaps the most underappreciated part of Pryor's work. For a start, first order logic for ordinary things, modal logic for abstractions. Pryor started rethinking the way that we draw the lines between what should be using first order logic for and what we should be using modal logic for. In the new version of the paper, the one put together by Per Hasley, Peter Erstrom, Torben Breuner, and Jack Copeland, the two papers that I mentioned earlier are split up, and the paper that follows quasi propositions and quasi individuals is a paper called egocentric logic. This paper, as I said before, it was papers 11 and 12. Now this is 11. And suddenly there's six more papers appearing because, and we know Pryor wanted them in this order, and he wanted these particular because before he died, he wrote down a list of what should be included and the order of these things. And what we are getting here, we're getting a lot of rethinking, part of which was explored by Kit Fine, developed by Kit Fine when he turned Worlds, Times, and Selves, where he put together an unfinished book by Pryor and edited it. A lot of the things that made up that later book were, as I said, added to the later edition of Papers in Time and Tense. But what we're getting there is lots of themes in which, for a start, as I said, Pryor is rethinking the distinction between what we should be thinking about in terms of first order logic, what we should be thinking about in terms of modal logic. And in particular, this step is taking us into new ways of dealing with first order modal logic. Now, in the classic thing of first order modal logic, it's very simple. You take a language of modal logic, you take a first order logic, and you bolt them together. As is also well known, the interaction between the first order logical component and the modal component is not wholly straightforward. For example, there's lots of technical results about how you are losing all sorts of properties. We know that in many cases the Barkhan formula is automatically provable, or the converse Barkhan formula. How do we deal with this? In these later papers, Pryor is exploring all of these themes, and as I say, attempting to play with languages in which, by using different forms of quantification over propositions and nominals, different way of designing the language, you are taking apart the modal component and the first order component. And I think he's taking it in this genuinely interesting new direction, in which you might roughly speaking call first order description logic, which is the thing that I'm beginning to get increasingly interested in. That this may be a way of exploring some classical themes. We also did a sort of, how can I put it, a rather amateurish deep dive into how can I put it, the use of the word quasi in his paper. If you look at the new papers added in the second edition of Papers in Time and Tense, the ones that Prior wanted to be added there, there's suddenly this huge explosion in the use of the word quasi. This is not a word used in early papers by Arthur Prior. Um, you get the occasional use of the word quasi, but it's just another English word. But in the seven or so papers that are added to the new edition of Papers and Times and Tense, there's this huge explosion of the term, and it's clear that actually from the very title of the unfinished books, Worlds, Times, and Selves, that he really thinks that he has got this logic that is capable of tackling interesting philosophical issues, not just about time, but also about selfhood and worldhood. It's unclear to me exactly what direction this is going. It is clear to me that there's a lot worth exploring here. It's also clear that perhaps the deepest look at this already is what was done by Kit Fine in his introduction to the unfinished Worlds, Times, and Selves book, where he's got a deep dive that goes in a number of interesting philosophical directions. Okay, I think that's about all I've got to say here. So let me just put up a picture of Arthur Pryor, 1914, 1969, well-known Australasian logician. And let me just call it a day here and say thank you for listening and apologize for my rather jet-lagged state here. I literally flew back from New Zealand 24 hours ago and I've had three exams yesterday and I got all the times wrong. So I am really unclear as to what sort of the planet I'm on, and if I have been less than coherent, please accept my sincerest apologies, and thank you very much.